Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, quiet walk through the confusing world of medieval beauty standards, the kind people supposedly aimed for while also dealing with mud, smoke, questionable hygiene, and whatever livestock happened to pass by. It's one of those topics that sounds glamorous until you remember mirrors weren't exactly reliable, and most people only saw their own face when the river was calm enough to act like one. But still, beauty mattered, even if the definition was drifting somewhere between practicality and wishful thinking. So let's settle in, get comfortable, and look at what people in the Middle Ages actually thought was beautiful, and how surprisingly inconvenient it all was. The first thing you notice is that medieval beauty operated on a kind of sleepy logic. Pale skin was prized, not because it looked elegant or ethereal in some romantic sense, but mostly because it meant you weren't outside doing chores from sunrise to whenever the rooster gave up. Being pale was basically the original out-of-office reply. If your complexion said, "I have never worked a field in my life," that was ideal. Of course, the problem was that most people did work fields, so maintaining a pale face meant hiding indoors a lot or covering up like a traveling linen shipment. Some even dusted their skin with ground lead because nothing says health and beauty like a material that quietly ruins you. Hair was another thing. Medieval people loved long hair, especially smooth, soft hair that gently draped over the shoulders. Unfortunately, water wasn't exactly a daily visitor, so hair tended to behave however it wanted. The beauty ideal said silky, reality said tangled, smoky, maybe slightly bread-scented depending on what you'd been doing near the hearth that day. Women sometimes braided their hair tight under linen caps to keep it controlled, which meant the beautiful look was less about the hair itself and more about pretending it was perfect beneath the fabric. It's a little like modern people saying, "Don't mind the mess, I know it's in here somewhere." Eyebrows had their own moment. A high, wide forehead was considered incredibly attractive. So attractive, in fact, that some women plucked or shaved their eyebrows and even pushed their hairline back to create more forehead real estate. The ideal was this smooth, serene upper face that looked like you were constantly thinking about something profound, even if the thought was mostly, "I hope the goats stay out of the herb garden this time." It was a strangely peaceful look, but probably cold in winter. Then there was the medieval fascination with small, delicate features. A tiny mouth was considered charming, even though food portions were not. People posed in portraits with pursed lips like they were trying not to wake up a sleeping baby. Soft, rounded cheeks were fashionable too, though achieving them without modern skincare meant accepting windburn as a natural part of the aesthetic. Beauty didn't come from products. It came from the weather deciding your face shape for you. Clothing played a huge role because nothing frames beauty like fabric that's slightly too heavy and smells faintly of last week's rain. Wealthy people wore finer materials, of course, but even then, laundry was more of a seasonal hobby than a habit. Colors mattered too. Pale blues and soft greens were seen as gentle and graceful, especially if you managed not to spill ale on them by noon. Beauty wasn't just visual. It was a full experience involving fabric weight, temperature, and a constant awareness of puddles. Men weren't off the hook either. A handsome medieval man walked this tightrope between strong and soft. Broad shoulders were good, but not too broad. A calm expression was good, but not too calm. Basically, look reliable, but not like you're about to deliver a 3-hour sermon. Beards went in and out of fashion depending on the century, but clean-shaven faces were often preferred. The problem was shaving without modern razors meant trusting a blade made by someone who also repaired farm tools. Teeth were a topic best avoided. Let's say the beauty standard for teeth was present. Smiling too widely was considered improper anyway, so there wasn't much pressure to show them off. This worked out for everyone involved. In the end, medieval beauty standards were less about perfection and more about giving the impression of having a quiet, unhurried life. Even if you didn't. It was about appearing calm, pale, and slightly mysterious, while everything around you made that almost impossible. But that was the charm of it. A kind of soft, half-asleep ideal that people reached for in a world that rarely cooperated. And of course, beauty in the Middle Ages didn't exist in isolation. It floated around inside homes that were dim, smoky, and filled with the quiet background noise of daily life. Crackling hearths, turning wheels, a neighbor arguing faintly through a wall that was definitely thinner than advertised. These environments shaped how people looked and how they thought they should look. A glowing complexion, for example, usually meant you'd just come in from the cold and your face was trying to thaw. And a healthy color could mean a long walk up a hill you didn't actually want to climb. Bathing habits didn't really help the beauty situation either. Depending on the century and which region you lived in, bathhouses could be common or suspicious, clean or questionable, relaxing, or a place you'd rather not describe out loud. Most people resorted to wiping themselves with cloth and calling it a day. But beauty standards didn't adjust to match reality. They stayed dreamy and aspirational, like a medieval version of an unreachable lifestyle blog. Scents are another thing that rarely get mentioned. Smelling nice wasn't much of a beauty requirement, mostly because smelling neutral was already difficult. Fire smoke, tanned leather, and sheep-related aromas were all normal parts of the personal fragrance palette. Herbs and flowers helped a little, but they were more of a polite suggestion than a solution. A pouch of lavender could mask a few things, but not everything, and certainly not for long. So when someone smelled pleasant, it was probably just because they'd passed by a merchant selling rosemary. Cosmetics existed, but they had a sleepy, handmade quality. Some people used crushed berries for lip tint or mixed chalk with water to lighten the skin. These were the early versions of quick fixes, except they didn't always stay where you put them. Rain, sweat, or even an unplanned sneeze could quickly undo the whole look. And because ingredients weren't exactly regulated, it was entirely possible to create a cosmetic product that worked beautifully and also shortened your life expectancy. The line between style and hazard was thin. Even posture was part of beauty. A graceful stance was admired, though achieving one after a long day of chores was ambitious. People were expected to carry themselves calmly and neatly, as if they had never once tripped over a bucket in their own doorway. Elegance was almost performative, a quiet, controlled presence that suggested inner peace, while your actual inner thoughts were about whether the bread burned. And then there were hands. Medieval poets loved talking about beautiful hands, usually soft, pale, and delicate. Reality disagreed. Most hands were strong, rough, and busy doing 10 different things that required tools with questionable ergonomics. But the ideal persisted. Hands that looked like they belonged to someone who spent their days reading instead of working. It was aspirational beauty at its most optimistic. The funny thing is, despite all these expectations, most medieval people didn't spend their lives obsessing over beauty. They cared, sure, but in a quiet, practical way. They wanted to look presentable for church, for festivals, for meetings with relatives who liked to judge things silently. But life was too demanding for vanity to be an all-day project. Beauty was more like a gentle hope. Maybe today the sun won't highlight every strange angle of my face. Maybe my hair will behave. Maybe the wind will be less dramatic. Still, beauty standards mattered socially. Looking proper helped with marriage prospects, work, and reputation. A neat appearance signaled stability, even if stability was something you only experienced on rare, lucky days. People dressed their best for important events, feasts, gatherings, ceremonies, knowing full well their clothing would collect crumbs and soot almost immediately, but trying anyway. In the end, medieval beauty was this blend of effort and acceptance. People reached for ideals they couldn't fully meet, but they did it with a kind of soft persistence, like brushing dust off a cloak even though it would return in 5 minutes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. A quiet kind of beauty shaped by weather, work, and a world that moved slowly. A beauty that didn't demand perfection, just the appearance of trying, without rushing, without noise, and without expecting the mirror to tell the truth. If you keep following the thread of medieval beauty, you eventually notice how much of it depended on lighting, specifically the warm, flickering glow of lamps and hearth fires. Under that kind of soft illumination, everyone looked a little smoother, a little calmer, a little more mysterious. Shadows softened jawlines. Pale linen veils diffused the light just enough to blur imperfections. It's possible that half of the beauty standards survived simply because no one ever saw each other under anything brighter than a candle. If medieval people suddenly walked into a modern dental office with fluorescent lights, the entire beauty system might have collapsed on the spot. Still, beauty wasn't just about appearance. It was also tied to behavior. Moving slowly and deliberately was considered graceful, though the pace probably had more to do with heavy garments and slippery floors than any aesthetic principle. Speaking softly was admired too. which made sense when every room echoed like it was built to amplify secrets. A calm voice seemed more beautiful because it didn't bounce off the walls like a misunderstanding waiting to happen. Jewelry added its own quiet charm. Rings, brooches, and modest pendants helped frame the face, though the real purpose was often practical, pinning things together so the clothing didn't fall apart at inconvenient moments. Gold and silver hinted at status, but most people wore simple metal or bone pieces. Beauty wasn't flashy, it was measured, like someone trying to look respectable without calling attention to the fact that they had chores in 10 minutes. Social class shaped beauty expectations heavily. Nobles had the luxury of aiming for the pale, serene ideal. Peasants didn't. Their version of beauty was more grounded: a clean tunic, hair neatly tied, hands washed enough to look like they hadn't just battled a field full of thorns. Within villages, looking nice meant looking tidy relative to the weather and whatever your job was that season. Beauty wasn't a competition. It was more like a brief moment where people tried to look better than they did yesterday, or at least less windblown. Festivals were the closest thing medieval culture had to a makeover montage. People wore their best clothing, styled their hair, and tried herbs, oils, or homemade powders to freshen up. These events offered rare chances to be seen in good light and better spirits. But even then, the ideal wasn't extravagance. It was subtle. A look that said, "I'm doing my best within the limits of this century." Portraits, when they existed, didn't help. Artists were less concerned with accuracy and more with social expectations. If the ideal look was serene and symmetrical, that's what the painting showed, regardless of what the person actually looked like on a humid day after chasing chickens. Portraits were less a reflection of the face and more a reflection of the culture's wishful thinking. And then there were the quietly enforced community opinions. If too many neighbors agreed your haircut wasn't flattering, that information circulated with the efficiency of an early social network. Compliments worked the same way. Someone remarking that your new coif looked very proper today could buoy a reputation for weeks. Beauty wasn't private. It was a communal discussion held in slow motion. Even aging had its own beauty arc. Older women were often respected for their wisdom, and the soft lines that came with age weren't always seen as flaws. Weathered skin reflected experience, and a calm posture suggested resilience. The beauty standard here wasn't youth, it was steadiness. A face that had seen seasons, harvests, losses, and celebrations carried a weight people respected, even if they wouldn't call it glamorous. Ultimately, medieval beauty standards drift through history like a faint lullaby. Slow, soft, slightly illogical, but strangely comforting. They weren't chasing perfection, they were chasing peace. A quiet face, a calm presence, a moment where the world felt gentle enough that even a smudged cheek or frizzy hair didn't matter. And maybe that's why exploring these standards feels so soothing now. They remind us of a time when beauty wasn't about being flawless, just about being visible, present, and still for long enough that the candlelight could do the rest. And when you look closely, medieval beauty standards reveal something else. They were less about attracting admiration and more about signaling that your life wasn't in complete disarray. A neat appearance suggested you had a little time, a little stability, maybe even a roof that didn't leak too aggressively when it rained. Beauty functioned like a quiet announcement: "I'm managing." In a world where managing was already an accomplishment, that alone counted as impressive. It's also telling how much clothing influenced the perception of beauty. Layers of linen, wool, or velvet didn't just keep people warm, they helped shape the silhouette. A well-fitted tunic or gown gave the illusion of softness, symmetry, and structure, even if the person underneath was tired from chores or slightly hunched from carrying buckets all morning. Girdles, belts, and ties cinched the body in gentle ways, creating a controlled outline that hinted at elegance without requiring too much cooperation from the spine. Clothing handled the heavy lifting so the wearer didn't have to. Admiration for slim bodies existed, but it wasn't about achieving a particular number or shape. It was more practical. Someone slightly slender was assumed to have better health, or at least better access to food that wasn't constantly burnt. At the same time, curves were seen as signs of warmth, fertility, and resilience. Medieval beauty didn't lean too hard in one direction. It swayed gently, like someone trying to adjust their balance in a crowded marketplace. It wasn't rigid, and it wasn't extreme. It was a soft set of preferences that ebbed and flowed with the seasons and the local harvest. Complexion mattered too, but in a very atmospheric way. A rosy flush from walking in the cold was considered charming. A faint glow from sitting near the fire was appealing. People in the Middle Ages didn't obsess over pores or undertones. They noticed the effects of weather, work, and warmth. A kind of natural illumination you couldn't bottle or recreate. Beauty wasn't a polished look. It was a momentary one. Hands and feet, oddly enough, appear again and again in medieval writings. A beautiful hand was gentle, pale, and refined. But that standard didn't survive much contact with reality. Still, poets couldn't resist describing them as if everyone had the hands of someone who'd never held a shovel in their life. Feet were rarely seen, which helped their reputation significantly. Hidden beneath layers of fabric and leather, they enjoyed a kind of mystery-based beauty. The less you revealed, the more ideal the image became. Even the sounds of daily life contributed. A soft voice was admired because it contrasted with the noisy world. Animals, carts, marketplace chatter, and the constant thud of someone chopping firewood. Speaking gently wasn't just beautiful, it was considerate. It created a pocket of quiet in a world that didn't offer much of it. Grace didn't require a stage, it required patience. And then there were the small rituals, combing hair slowly in the morning light, washing the face with cool water from a basin, adjusting the folds of a cloak before stepping outside. These were the medieval equivalents of self-care, performed not to chase an impossible ideal, but to steady the mind for the day. Beauty routines were quiet, quick, and unceremonious. No one expected miracles, just a bit of order before facing whatever the weather, livestock, or marketplace decided to contribute. When people did catch glimpses of themselves, a distorted reflection on polished metal, a fleeting image in still water, it wasn't detailed enough to trigger overthinking. It simply confirmed presence. Yes, that's me, more or less. Without constant visual reminders of imperfections, beauty became a broader, gentler concept. People weren't measuring themselves against impossible images. They were measuring themselves against how calmly they carried their lives. And maybe that's why medieval beauty feels oddly comforting now. It's slow, sleepy, and shaped by reality rather than fantasy. You didn't need to be exceptional. You just needed to be composed, tidy, and willing to let candlelight do half the work. In a way, beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't something you chased. It was something you settled into, like sitting down at the end of a long day and letting the world be soft for a moment. There's also something quietly revealing about how medieval people reacted to beauty in others. Compliments weren't dramatic declarations. They were more like gentle acknowledgments, soft observations delivered in passing. Someone might say, "You look well today," and that alone carried the whole weight of a beauty standard. It wasn't about standing out. It was about appearing harmonious with the moment, like you fit neatly into the slow rhythm of the world around you. The highest form of beauty was often described as pleasant, a word that asks for very little and promises nothing loud. You can imagine a medieval morning, a thin beam of pale light slipping through the shutters, dust floating in the quiet air, a small basin of cold water waiting. Someone splashes their face, smooths their hair, adjusts their garments, and that's it. No strong colors, no heavy scents, no dramatic transformation. Beauty lived in the stillness of the routine, not in any dramatic reveal. Even the tools were simple: a wooden comb, a bit of cloth, maybe a dab of oil if you were lucky. Most people approached grooming the same way they approached chores, patiently, without hurry, and with a resigned understanding that nature would undo half their efforts by lunchtime. Seasons shaped appearance too. Winter gave cheeks a soft red tint and made noses look permanently thoughtful. Summer deepened the skin despite everyone's best attempts to stay pale. Autumn brought wind-burned tones, and spring occasionally decorated faces with pollen and watery eyes. Beauty was woven into nature's cycles. People didn't fight it so much as adapt, accepting that each season came with its own aesthetic adjustments, whether they asked for them or not. And yet, for all its softness, medieval beauty could bring pressure. A woman with a lower, natural hairline might feel compelled to pluck it higher. A man with a rounder face might attempt to appear sterner for portraits or gatherings. Expectations were gentle but present, hovering around like a sleepy reminder. No one demanded perfection, but they quietly hoped for it in a way that didn't disturb the air. In villages, beauty often blended into usefulness. A strong, capable body was admired even if it didn't match noble ideals. Sun-darkened skin wasn't mocked, it was simply noted as part of someone's life. A pair of steady hands could be just as attractive as a pale, delicate pair, maybe more so, depending on the season's workload. People didn't separate beauty from character as sharply as we do now. If someone looked kind or dependable, that alone carried its own charm. Festive days shifted everything slightly. Ribbons appeared in hair, tunics were brushed clean, and faces were washed with more enthusiasm than usual. The collective effort created a kind of temporary glow over the whole community. Beauty became a shared, slow event. Families moved in groups, lanterns swayed, and everyone looked slightly softer beneath the twilight sky. Even then, no one was trying to dazzle anyone else. They were trying to participate, to blend into the gentle celebration. And status markers weren't always about looking better. They were often about being more visible. A noblewoman's pale veil shimmered just enough to say she wasn't working in a field today. A merchant's clean boots suggested he'd been successful enough to avoid doing his own cart repairs. Beauty and wealth overlapped, but not in a flashy way. The statement was always mild, almost apologetically refined. When people grew older, beauty standards folded around them in a comforting way. Lines around the eyes spoke of years lived, and gray-streaked hair hinted at stories worth telling. Elders weren't expected to maintain the youthful glow idealized in younger adults. Their beauty was measured in calmness, wisdom, and the steady pace of someone who has already survived more winters than they care to count. In many ways, aging was the most peaceful part of the medieval beauty cycle. The pressure softened, and dignity became its own quiet aesthetic. If you step back, what emerges isn't a list of strict demands, but a kind of atmospheric preference. Beauty in medieval times was slow, muted, and shaped by candlelight, weather, and daily necessity. It thrived in soft edges, calm expressions, and a life that looked ordered enough to suggest a moment of peace. It didn't ask people to reinvent themselves, just to straighten their tunic, smooth their hair, and step gently into the day. And maybe that's why thinking about it feels oddly soothing. It's beauty without urgency, beauty without comparison charts, beauty without 20 different words for undertones. It's the kind of beauty that grows quietly in dim light, settles comfortably on a tired face, and doesn't mind sharing space with dust and smoke. A beauty that doesn't rush you, judge you, or demand anything sharp. Just a small, steady presence, soft, patient, and enough. And when evening settled in, medieval beauty softened even further. Candle flames shrank into gentle, wavering points of light, reshaping faces into calm silhouettes. Shadows stretched long across stone floors, and everything, from clothing to hair to the curve of a cheek, took on a quieter form. Beauty at night required almost no effort. The dimness did most of the work, smoothing every feature and turning even the most exhausted expression into something contemplative. A person could sit by the hearth after a long day, shoulders drooping slightly, and still look serene in the flicker of warm light. Even the act of preparing for bed carried its own subtle aesthetic. People loosened their garments, unbraided their hair, and washed with whatever warm water was left in the pot. The motions were slow, practical, nearly ceremonial. Nothing dramatic happened, just small acts that brought a sense of order to the end of the day. A comb drawn through tangled strands, a cloak folded neatly, a candle trimmed. These weren't beauty rituals in the modern sense, but they were enough to signal calm, care, and a readiness to drift into rest. In a way, nighttime was when medieval beauty felt most complete, when the world expected the least and the face could finally relax. Homes themselves played a role. The soft rustle of straw bedding, the muted creak of wooden beams, the fading warmth from the hearth, all of it formed a backdrop that made everyone appear gentler than they had hours earlier while hauling buckets or dealing with stubborn goats. Beauty in this setting wasn't something you performed. It simply appeared. the same way a quiet mist settles over fields at dusk. A tired expression became meaningful rather than flawed. Wrinkles around the eyes softened into stories. Even soot-smudged cheeks looked warm and human in the glow. Relationships influenced beauty perception too. In close-knit villages, people grew accustomed to each other's faces, familiar lines, habitual expressions, the way someone tilted their head when listening. That familiarity created its own quiet charm. A smile didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be sincere. Eyes didn't need to sparkle, they just needed to meet yours without hurry. Beauty became something stable, something found in the rhythm of shared days rather than in fleeting moments of perfection. And yet, despite the simplicity, medieval beauty expectations still nudged people gently from the background. A mother might encourage her daughter to smooth her hair before attending a feast. A young man might adjust his cloak twice before walking into the market square. These were subtle gestures, more about confidence than appearance. No one expected transformation, they just wanted to feel aligned with the moment. Even illness didn't erase beauty entirely. A pale, tired face was often described in medieval writings with tenderness rather than criticism. A person recovering from hardship carried a kind of fragile beauty, a reminder of survival rather than decline. Hardship left marks, but those marks fit into the larger rhythm of life, the same way storms left patterns on old wooden doors. Travelers brought new beauty influences into towns. Stories of distant lands, unusual styles, strange perfumes, all of it stirred curiosity. But medieval people rarely tried to imitate foreign fashions too directly. They absorbed the ideas in small, sleepy doses, adapting them to their own slow-moving world. A new braid pattern, a different shade of cloth, a slightly altered sleeve shape. Even these mild changes spread slowly, like whispers moving through a crowd in no rush to reach the end. By the end of any given week, beauty wasn't something people evaluated with sharp attention. It floated in the background like faint music, always there, shaping impressions and interactions, but never loud enough to dominate. You might notice someone's hair catching firelight nicely, or the way a cloak fell neatly over their shoulders, but the observation would drift away almost as quickly as it arrived. Medieval beauty was a passing thought, not an ongoing project, and that might be the most calming part of all. Beauty existed, but it didn't demand to be chased. It didn't insist on daily maintenance. It didn't loom over people's choices. It was simply woven into the pace of life, sometimes visible, sometimes forgotten, always gentle. A soft presence in a world shaped by weather, work, and candle flame. A reminder that looking good was never the point. Looking like yourself, in a moment of quiet, was enough. And if you step into the social spaces of the Middle Ages, markets, churchyards, taverns, you see how beauty gently drifted through public life without ever turning into a performance. In the marketplace, faces were flushed from walking, voices mingled with the clatter of carts, and clothing picked up dust within minutes. Whatever ideal beauty people aimed for in the morning usually softened into something more realistic by midday. But no one minded. Beauty wasn't measured second by second. It lived in impressions, in the way someone carried themselves or smiled briefly while passing a neighbor. Church gatherings added another layer. People wore their cleanest garments, tied their hair neatly, and tried their best to look composed. But even here, beauty remained understated. A calm expression, a modest posture, and clothing arranged without chaos were enough. The ideals weren't loud or attention-grabbing. They were quiet, respectful, and designed to blend into the atmosphere of prayer and stillness. The goal was to look proper, not perfect. In taverns, where conversation rolled slowly and the air carried a mix of hearth smoke and ale, beauty shifted again. Candlelight softened everything. People looked warmer, friendlier, less weighed down by the day's work. A person who might seem plain at noon could look gently luminous in the evening glow. Medieval beauty had a way of appearing and disappearing depending on the light, the mood, and the softness of the moment. And despite the lack of mirrors, people still paid attention to each other's appearance. A braid done neatly, a cloak pinned just right, the way someone's eyes looked brighter after rest. These tiny details held more meaning than any elaborate grooming ritual. Beauty was woven into small observations, not dramatic declarations. Courtly settings took these ideals and stretched them into something almost poetic. Nobles wrote verses comparing a lady's pale hands to white lilies, or describing a knight's calm gaze as if it could quiet storms. These were exaggerated, of course, but they reflected a culture that liked beauty best when it was gentle and symbolic rather than literal. A lady didn't need an impossibly smooth complexion. She just needed to look serene enough to inspire a metaphor. A knight didn't need to be sculpted. He just needed to appear steady, like he'd stand quietly through a long-winded speech. Even among friends, beauty functioned like a quiet kind of support. A companion might help straighten a cloak, retie a belt, or brush lint from a sleeve. These small acts carried more weight than compliments. Beauty was maintained through cooperation, not competition. People tended to each other's appearances in the same slow, practical way they tended to chores. And then there was the world outside the village. The woods, the fields, the distant roads. Traveling often left people windblown, dusty, and a little dazed from the uneven paths. But that didn't erase their beauty, it simply reshaped it. A traveler arriving with windswept hair and tired eyes might be seen as quietly striking, the journey adding a kind of rugged softness to their appearance. Once again, beauty didn't demand control. It adapted to whatever the day offered. Children had their own kind of medieval beauty too. Cheeks reddened from play, hair sticking out from under caps, hands smudged with dirt and berries. No one expected them to match adult ideals. Their beauty was the beauty of movement, laughter, and unfiltered presence. In a world without cameras or constant images, these moments lived briefly and then dissolved, remembered not for perfection, but for feeling. And in old age, beauty mellowed into something peaceful and steady. Wrinkles, once barely noticed, deepened into maps of lived experience. Silver hair caught the light in soft streaks. A slower walk, a gentler voice. These became their own quiet aesthetic, respected and admired. Older faces weren't edited into youth. They were held as they were, with dignity and calm. Everything about medieval beauty circles back to one idea. It didn't need to be chaste. It didn't ask people to reinvent themselves or battle their own reflections. It slipped in and out of daily life like a breeze moving through a quiet room, felt more than analyzed. And perhaps that's why it remains so soothing to look back on. It reminds us that beauty can be soft, patient, unhurried, something that grows in the dim light of an evening hearth and lingers, not because it demands attention, but because it keeps you company in the quiet. And beauty, in its medieval way, lingered in the small rituals of social life, moments so ordinary that people didn't even realize they were participating in a shared aesthetic. At a village well, for example, women gathered to draw water, talk softly, and brush stray strands of hair back under their veils. The scene wasn't dramatic, just linen, sunlight, murmured gossip, and the steady movement of hands. But to anyone passing by, the moment carried a quiet, unintentional charm. The light caught on buckets, the wind lifted a loose braid, and beauty appeared. Not sculpted, not polished, just present. Inside workshops, where artisans shaped wood, stitched cloth, or hammered metal, beauty took on a more textured form. Faces smudged with dust, brows furrowed in concentration, and the rhythmic movement of skilled hands created an almost meditative picture. A carpenter smoothing a plank or a weaver passing threads across a loom didn't intend to look graceful, but the repetition and focus gave them a kind of grounded elegance. Beauty here wasn't about features, it was about presence, the calm that settles over someone absorbed in their craft. In the countryside, shepherds and farmers had their own version of quiet beauty. Sunlight caught in tangled hair. A cloak rippled in the wind as someone checked on distant fields. The landscape did half the work, framing people in soft hills, morning mist, or fading twilight. A person standing alone against a wide sky always looked more meaningful, even if they were just squinting at sheep that had wandered somewhere inconvenient again. And when travelers arrived in a village, dusty from the road, their appearances told stories long before they spoke. Boots worn from miles, cloaks patched and repatched, eyes a little tired but alert. That kind of beauty wasn't delicate or idealized. It was sturdy, earned, shaped by weather and distance. Medieval people recognized this look instantly, and often admired it in the same understated way they admired everything else. A brief glance, a quiet nod, nothing more. Celebrations added flashes of color to this muted world. During festivals, garlands of flowers, ribbons woven into hair, and embroidered hems created a momentary brightness. People looked more vibrant, not because the standards changed, but because the mood did. Beauty became communal, a shared glow of food, music, laughter, and flickering torches. Even those who didn't feel particularly attractive found themselves softened by the atmosphere. Candlelight and warm air don't judge anyone. But behind all these gentle standards, there was also the simple truth that life shaped people more than ideals did. A woman's hands might be rough from washing linens, but steady and capable. A man's shoulders might be rounded from years of work, but dependable. Medieval beauty wasn't aspirational in the way modern beauty is. It didn't demand transformation. It just reflected what life naturally created in a person. Calmness, resilience, a face shaped by seasons and routine. Even illness, exhaustion, or hardship didn't erase beauty. They added depth to it. A tired face told a story. A scar hinted at past struggles. A quiet gaze revealed more character than any cosmetic could. Medieval beauty wasn't scared of reality. It included it. A person didn't need to hide their weariness. They simply carried it with them, and others understood. In love and courtship, beauty turned softer still. A man might admire the way a woman's veil moved in the breeze, or how she laughed quietly instead of loudly. A woman might find charm in a man's shy posture, or the way he held his cloak when nervous. None of this was dramatic, no grand gestures, just small, human observations. Beauty that emerged from noticing someone in a moment of being themselves. At the end of the day, beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't a mirror-based pursuit. It was atmospheric. It lived in movement, light, and fleeting impressions. It lived in the soft shape of a shadow on a wall, or the glow of a face near the hearth, or the calm carried in someone's voice during a conversation that drifted long into the night. And maybe that's why medieval beauty feels so comforting now, because it asked almost nothing from people. No perfection, no pressure, no endless adjustments. Just a quiet presence in a world that moved slowly enough for beauty to breathe. A world where a face softened by firelight, or a hand steady in its work, was more than enough to be considered beautiful. And if you watch how beauty moved through the rhythms of an ordinary medieval week, it becomes clear that it wasn't something people chased. It was something that drifted in and out of life the way weather did. On market days, for example, beauty wasn't in the faces themselves so much as the movement. The shuffle of feet over packed earth, the sway of baskets, the flutter of cloaks caught in sudden breezes. Everyone looked a little windblown, a little distracted, a little tired. And yet, in that mild disorder, there was a strange visual harmony. A woman adjusting a headscarf in passing, a man brushing dust from his sleeves, a child trailing behind with berry-stained fingers. Beauty wasn't staged. It simply accumulated in small gestures. In the fields, it appeared in quieter ways. A young woman standing knee-deep in grain, her expression soft with concentration. A man lifting his head just long enough to scan the horizon before returning to work. Sweat, sun, and effort shaped the face differently than candlelight did, but not unpleasantly. There was a sort of endurance-based beauty, one that came from familiarity with land and season, from knowing how to move steadily through the long stretch of a working day. A person who understood their environment carried a calm that was more attractive than any cosmetic. Inside manors or more affluent homes, beauty followed different rules, still quiet, still subtle, but slightly more curated. Pale veils were washed more often, garments fell more smoothly, and hands were a little less marked by work. But even here, ideals were tempered by reality. A gown brushed against rough stone and frayed, a veil caught on a splintered beam. The world simply didn't allow anything to remain pristine for long. So beauty was measured more by composure, by how gracefully someone straightened their clothing after something inevitably snagged. And when music filled a hall, slow flute melodies, soft drums, the occasional hesitant lute chord, beauty shifted again. Faces relaxed, shoulders loosened, expressions settled into something peaceful. Dancing wasn't frantic, it was careful and measured, designed to avoid tripping over heavy skirts or loose floorboards. Movements blended into a slow, steady pattern that made everyone look almost dreamlike. Beauty flourished in that atmosphere, not as perfection, but as quiet participation in something communal. Even silence had a role. When evening prayers ended and people filed out into the cool air, there was a moment, brief but real, where the world felt suspended. Footsteps softened, voices hushed, lanterns glowed like muted stars in a world without electricity. In those moments, faces looked gentler, as if the entire village exhaled at once. Beauty was something you felt in the stillness, not something you saw. Animals, oddly enough, shaped beauty too. A cat curling around someone's ankles gave them a gentler look. A horse leaning its head toward a familiar hand softened the person holding the reins. Medieval life was filled with creatures, and interacting with them gave people small flashes of tenderness that softened their features in ways no artificial routine could. And then, in the deepest part of night, when most of the village slept and only a few embers glowed in hearths, beauty became almost entirely atmospheric. The outline of a sleeping face, a cloak pulled up to the chin, hair spread loosely across straw bedding. None of it was dramatic. None of it would be considered glamorous. But in the dimness, with the world utterly quiet, there was something undeniably gentle about the way people existed, unposed, unguarded, at rest. In truth, medieval beauty wasn't defined by standards so much as by moments where a person's face, posture, or movement aligned briefly with their surroundings. A girl laughing under a tree while trying to braid her hair back into place. A man sitting by the well with his hands resting loosely over his knees. A pair of children dozing against each other during a long sermon. These were the images that lingered. And maybe that's the real heart of it. Medieval beauty wasn't a goal. It wasn't a pursuit. It was simply the natural result of living in a world where things moved slowly, light was soft, expectations were mild, and daily life created its own kind of gentle aesthetic without anyone trying. A beauty that lived in stillness, in effort, in rest, in the quiet human moments that flickered like candlelight and disappeared just as softly. And when you think about how medieval people actually saw each other, without the sharpness of modern light, without photographs, without constant comparisons, you start to understand why their idea of beauty was so soft. Most faces were seen in motion, not frozen. Seen in dimness, not scrutiny. Seen while doing something ordinary, not posing. A person's beauty existed in the few quiet seconds you noticed them before life hurried you elsewhere. Take the village green at dusk. People gathered after chores, leaning on fences, talking in low voices, tending to animals, or just resting their feet. The last bit of daylight settled over everything like a thin veil. No one looked perfect, but everyone looked gentle. Dirt smudges softened into shadows, wrinkles blurred, and tired eyes reflected the fading light. It was impossible not to look at least a little peaceful. Beauty lived in the calm between tasks. At home, around the hearth, it deepened. Someone mending a tunic in the orange glow looked patient and thoughtful. Someone stirring a pot looked focused and steady. Even the smallest expression, lifting a brow, smiling faintly, staring into the flames, seemed deliberate simply because the lighting slowed everything down. Firelight has a way of forgiving every flaw and highlighting every quiet quality. It may have been the most reliable beauty tool of the age. In the narrow alleyways between houses, beauty took on a quieter shape. You'd see a silhouette carrying a basket, or a figure framed by a wooden doorway, or someone stepping carefully across uneven stones. The body moved slowly out of necessity, giving every gesture a kind of natural grace. Even a simple turn of the head seemed thoughtful. Medieval architecture wasn't polished, but it framed people in a way that made them look intentional, even when they were just trying not to trip. If you visited a monastery, you'd find another version of beauty entirely. Still, peaceful, almost austere. Faces were calm from routine and repetition. Hands were steady from work. Voices were measured. There was a beauty in the discipline, the quiet rhythm, the way robes fell in straight lines. It wasn't decorative beauty, it was contemplative, a beauty that came from being undistracted. In the manor halls, among nobles, beauty stretched itself into formality. Posture mattered more. Gestures were smaller. Clothing added structure. But even here, the pacing remained slow. People moved with the weight of layered garments and long conversations. Beauty wasn't an attempt to impress. It was the outcome of living in a world where rushing would simply make you fall. Outdoors, in bad weather, beauty turned rugged. Rain darkened clothing but gave it character. Wind pulled strands of hair free, weaving them into the moment. A storm didn't ruin anyone's appearance, it just added texture to it. A person with rain-speckled lashes or wind-roughed cheeks looked alive, shaped by the world rather than separate from it. Children, muddy and busy, added their own raw charm. Hair sticking up, tunics untucked, faces flushed from running. They were beautiful in the way only carefree motion can be. Adults didn't correct them much. There was no ideal they needed to match. Their existence was the beauty. Even illness had its own quiet aesthetic, though no one would have called it beauty outright. A face softened by fever looked fragile. A blanket tucked around shoulders signaled care. A bowl of broth steaming nearby made the scene tender. Beauty hid in the sympathy, not the suffering. And love, real, everyday love, shaped beauty more predictably than any standard. A man might notice how sunlight touched the edge of his wife's veil. A woman might find her husband most handsome when he was simply resting after work, head bowed, hands folded in his lap. These weren't dramatic realizations. They were quiet recognitions that happened again and again over years. Beauty grew through familiarity, not surprise. In the end, medieval beauty was less a collection of rules and more a landscape, a soft, slow-moving world where faces were shaped by firelight, weather, work, and time. No sharp lines, no impossible ideals, just human beings existing gently within their surroundings. And maybe that's why the idea feels so soothing to revisit now. It reminds us that beauty doesn't have to be loud or flawless. It can be humble, atmospheric, steady, something that settles over you like the end of a long day, warm, dim, and calm. And if you imagine stepping into a medieval village at first light, you'd see beauty at its sleepiest. The world eased awake slowly. Roosters, soft footsteps, the scrape of a wooden door, someone stretching beneath a wool cloak. Faces were puffy from sleep, hair slightly flattened, clothing hastily pulled together. And yet there was something quietly appealing about it, a kind of natural softness that comes before the mind fully catches up to the body. Morning beauty wasn't polished, it was tender, warm from blankets, edged with drowsiness. No one looked prepared, and that was precisely what made the moment gentle. As the day unfolded, beauty kept changing shape. Mid-morning light bounced off water buckets and metal tools, illuminating faces in quick flashes. Someone wiping their brow, someone laughing softly at a small joke, someone pausing to rest a hand on a fence. These tiny moments stitched together a kind of everyday charm that appeared and vanished, unnoticed by the people living it. Medieval beauty wasn't about holding a look, it was about drifting into and out of one without realizing. In the woodlands, beauty mixed with quiet solitude. A forager kneeling among herbs, the hem of their cloak brushing soft moss. A hunter pausing under a canopy of leaves, breath visible in cool air. Light filtered through the trees like scattered gold dust, catching on hair and fabric. Even the silence carried aesthetic weight, soft, enveloping, slow the senses. It was beauty that required no audience, no approval, just a moment of stillness in nature. Travelers on the road embodied yet another form of beauty, not the delicate kind, but something shaped by movement, weather, and miles walked. Cloaks fluttered behind them, boots stirred dust, and their faces held that faint, thoughtful expression you see in people who've been alone with their thoughts too long. To villagers watching them pass, they looked mysterious, beautiful in the sense that they carried stories in their posture. Even labor had its own quiet grace. A person bent over a field moved with a certain rhythm. A blacksmith hammering metal glowed with a halo of sparks. A baker dusted with flour looked like part of the hearth itself. These scenes weren't elegant in a polished way, but they had a stability to them, a beauty rooted in effort and purpose. The hands, the posture, the focus, all of it created a picture deeper than any formal standard. During meals, beauty softened again. Families gathered around long wooden tables, steam rising from bowls, hands passing bread and ladles. Firelight bounced off faces, turning them into silhouettes with warm edges. People relaxed, unburdened by the demands of work, and the softness returned. There was beauty in the ease, The way someone leaned their head back after laughing, or how someone rested their chin on their hand while listening. Even the clatter of wooden spoons blended into a comforting background. On long walks home in the evening, beauty belonged to the landscape as much as to the people. A single figure framed against pink sky, a pair of friends talking softly as they followed the path, shadows stretching ahead in elongated shapes. Evening light made everyone look more thoughtful, more peaceful, as if the day's noise had finally released its grip. And when storms rolled through, they reshaped beauty entirely. Wind whipped hair into quick waves, cloaks snapped like sails. Rain blurred every outline into soft watercolor strokes. A person running for shelter might look chaotic, but when they stopped beneath an eave, breathing hard, water streaking down their face, they looked alive in a way no still moment could capture. Storms gave faces an honesty the sun couldn't. Nighttime brought the gentlest version of all. The world curled inward, voices lowered, and faces turned warm and indistinct near the hearth. Someone reading quietly by fire glow looked serene. Someone threading wool or repairing a torn sleeve looked peaceful. Even exhaustion looked poetic when softened by shadows. Beauty at night wasn't visual, it was atmospheric, drifting through the smell of wood smoke and the muffled crackle of embers. And in all of this, the most striking thing is how beauty never stood alone. It was always attached to life, to chores, weather, light, sound, quiet, connection. It wasn't a mask or a performance. It wasn't something to perfect. It was something that settled onto people moment by moment, like dust, like warmth, like a sigh. The world shaped the people, and in turn, the people shaped the world, gently, slowly, without realizing they were beautiful at all. And if you step back far enough, you start to see medieval beauty not as a set of standards at all, but as a rhythm, a slow, steady pulse woven into the fabric of daily life. It showed up whenever people moved without hurry, whenever light softened the edges of a face, whenever the world quieted just long enough for someone to simply be themselves. Consider the long, narrow streets of a medieval town at midday. Laundry hung between windows swayed gently overhead. Footsteps echoed on the stone. A baker leaned out of his doorway to check the weather, wiping flour from his hands without thinking. A group of children traced circles in the dust with sticks. No one posed, no one checked a mirror, and yet the entire scene carried its own quiet aesthetic. Lines, shadows, and human figures arranged by accident, not intention. Beauty slipped in naturally, the way a warm breeze finds its way through a cracked shutter. At the riverbanks, beauty changed shape again. Women washing clothes moved slowly, rhythmically, their motions almost hypnotic. Wet fabric glimmered under the sun, droplets catching light like tiny sparks. Their voices floated in and out of conversation, soft and unhurried. And when they paused, hands resting on their knees, hair sticking to damp foreheads, there was a tired, unpolished charm that felt more sincere than anything an ideal could dictate. In marketplaces, beauty came from energy rather than calm. Merchants calling out prices, neighbors greeting each other with quiet nods. The flick of a horse's tail, the clink of coins, the rustle of produce being weighed. People didn't look their best there, faces shiny from heat, tunics rumpled, hair escaping from bindings, but they looked alive. The messy vibrancy of it all created a kind of kinetic beauty that lingered only as long as the crowd did. Inside small houses, beauty was found in intimacy. A parent braiding a child's hair with practiced motions, a husband draping a cloak over his wife's shoulders before she stepped outside, a grandmother smoothing wrinkles from a tablecloth before supper. These were tender moments, not polished ones. Beauty shaped by care, by habit, by quiet affection passed between people who rarely named it. And if you follow these scenes into the countryside, the world stretches open. A shepherd leaning on his staff as sheep drift like clouds over a hill. A young woman gathering herbs, skirts brushing tall grass. A laborer standing at the edge of a field, back warmed by sun, watching birds scatter when he shifts his weight. There's beauty in stillness here, in the space between sounds, in the long sigh of a breeze moving across wheat. No ideal could compete with a moment that simple. Then there were feast days, when beauty briefly stepped into view with intention. Hair braided more neatly, clothing cleaned and rearranged, flowers gathered, faces washed with extra care. But even then, it wasn't about achieving perfection, just participating in the gentle uplift of the day. A girl adjusting the ribbon in her braid, a boy smoothing the front of his tunic. Beauty flickered in the preparation itself, not the result. The older generations carried a different version of beauty, one built on memory. Deep lines etched by laughter and loss, hands worn from work, eyes that had watched dozens of seasons shift. Their beauty wasn't delicate, it was steady, like the shape of an old wooden door that's weathered but dependable. Children often found comfort in those faces, the way animals recognize calmness in someone who moves without haste. And friendship created its own aesthetic. Two people sharing a bench, talking in low tones, each leaning slightly toward the other. A group repairing a fence together, pausing occasionally to laugh at something only they understood. Beauty lived in these connections, the way bodies angled toward companionship without realizing it. By the time night fell, the entire world participated in the softest form of beauty. Lanterns glowed, hearths murmured. People settled under blankets, faces slackening into rest. Outside, the sky pressed down gently, muffling sound. Inside, shadows swayed on walls in slow patterns. Beauty wasn't something you saw, it was something you breathed with, something that wrapped around you quietly before sleep. And that's the secret of medieval beauty. It was never about trying, never about fixing or improving. It was born from slowness, from dimness, from routine, from weather, from community. A kind of drifting, atmospheric presence that touched everyone equally, noble, peasant, traveler, child. A beauty that didn't strive to impress, a beauty that simply existed, softly, beside whoever happened to notice it. And when you carry this idea further, letting it settle, letting it breathe, you begin to understand how medieval beauty wasn't really seen in the sharp way we look at things now. It was absorbed, noticed gradually, understood slowly. It was something people lived beside, not something they analyzed. A face wasn't an object to judge. It was simply another part of the scenery, shaped by the same sun, wind, and quiet routines as everything else around it. Think about the long walk from one village to another. Travelers rarely hurried. The road curved gently, lined with hedges and stones warmed by the afternoon sun. Every so often, someone would stop to rest beneath a tree, letting the branches filter the light into soft patterns. Their hair, dusted from the road, caught the glow in a muted way. Their eyes, tired but calm, reflected the long distance behind them. No one would have called that moment beautiful out loud, yet anyone passing by would have felt something settle softly in their chest at the sight. Medieval beauty lived most comfortably in these unhurried pauses. In the meadows, when farmers took brief breaks from the weight of the day, beauty drifted through the stillness like a slow breeze. Someone kneeling in tall grass, hands planted firmly, breath rising and falling with a steady rhythm. Someone sitting with their back against a tree, eyes half closed, letting the world be quiet for a minute. The body looked tired, but not defeated. There was a fullness to it, a beauty born from honest work and the calm that followed it. Inside kitchens, where warmth gathered from the hearth and steam rose from pots, beauty came from repetition. A woman kneading dough with patient hands, a man chopping herbs with careful rhythm, a child sweeping crumbs into a small pile with serious concentration. These scenes weren't graceful in a delicate sense, but in a grounded one. Movements were steady, familiar, shaped by years of habit. And in that reliability, there was something quietly elegant. At the edges of forests, beauty lived in caution, the way someone turned their head slowly when they heard a rustle, or how they held a lantern close when stepping over roots and fallen branches. Expressions were alert but gentle, never exaggerated. The woods taught people to move softly, to listen, to be aware of their surroundings. That awareness softened the face, sharpening only the eyes. Even fear in the Middle Ages carried a kind of subdued grace, stripped of theatrics. On bridges and river crossings, beauty appeared in silhouettes. A figure outlined against sky or water always looked calmer than they felt. The cloak fluttering softly, the posture leaning slightly against the breeze. Even someone simply waiting for another to catch up became part of the scenery, a patient shape on a quiet path. Medieval life created these moments constantly, without meaning to, and in the rare places where joy gathered, weddings, small tavern songs, modest celebrations, beauty brightened just a little. Not loudly, not extravagantly, but like embers glowing slightly warmer. People laughed without holding back, their whole bodies involved. Someone clapped off beat and didn't mind. Someone else leaned against a post, watching with soft amusement. Faces lit by torchlight looked warmer, eyes fuller, cheeks flushed from drink or dancing. It wasn't glamour, it was presence, beauty shaped by good company and firelight. Even sorrow held its own quiet aesthetic. A person sitting alone near the fields at dusk, arms wrapped around their knees. A widow lighting a small candle by a windowsill. A family moving slowly through a dim hallway, speaking in hushed voices. The world softened around grief, dimming its edges. Medieval beauty didn't avoid sadness. It wrapped itself gently around it, as if acknowledging that life, in all its heaviness, shaped a person's face just as much as joy did. The passing of seasons reshaped everything further. Winter whitened eyelashes and turned breath into mist, giving faces a fragile, fleeting loveliness. Spring brought mud-streaked hems and wind-blown hair, but also brightness in the eyes after months of cold. Summer gilded skin with warmth, making even tired faces look glowing in the late afternoon. Autumn carved the world into muted golds and browns, draping people in the same palette, giving them a rustic softness that felt almost painterly. By nightfall, when nearly every home was reduced to a few warm points of light, beauty returned to its calmest form. A quiet figure sitting by the embers, a hand reaching to close a wooden shutter, a face resting on folded arms, half asleep at the table. These were the moments medieval people lived the most and noticed the least. Moments where the world slowed enough that beauty became indistinguishable from ordinary life. And maybe that's the truest part of it. Medieval beauty wasn't something people pursued. It was something that happened while they went about their days, gentle, unforced, drifting in and out of view like smoke from a hearth. A beauty made not from ideals but from rhythm, not from perfection but from presence. A beauty that lived quietly, softly, beside anyone patient enough to see it. And if you follow medieval beauty all the way into the quieter corners of life, the parts without crowds, without festivals, without daily tasks, you find it resting in solitude, almost unnoticed. In small moments when someone was truly alone, beauty unfolded in ways no standard could define. Think of someone sitting on a low wall just outside the village, watching distant fields shift under the wind. Their face relaxed, shoulders lowering as the world widened around them. No audience, no pressure, just a person existing in a large, slow-moving landscape. In those moments, beauty wasn't something they wore. It was something that seeped out simply because they were still enough for the world to catch up to them. Or imagine a young woman brushing her hair by an open window at dawn. The light was soft, muted by morning haze. Her reflection, if she even bothered to glance at the warped metal mirror, was blurred, incomplete. She had no reason to fuss over every strand, so she didn't. She brushed until the tangles eased, then tied her hair back and went on with her day. Beauty wasn't a pursuit. It was the byproduct of a quiet routine. In small chapels where candles pooled their light onto stone floors, beauty became reverent. People knelt, sat, or bowed with a stillness that made their features softer. Shadows hugged their faces, blurring imperfections until only shapes and outlines remained. Prayer wasn't about looking graceful, but the act itself created grace. Slow gestures, lowered eyes, hands clasped gently. Even the silence had texture. And in workshops late at night, when the rest of the village slept, a single lantern illuminated a figure bent over a task, mending a tool, finishing a carving, wiping down a blade. Their concentration created its own calm. The world shrank to the small circle of light around them, and the face within it looked quietly determined. Sweat, smudges, fatigue, all softened in the glow. Medieval beauty didn't hide labor. It embraced the stillness inside effort. Even sickness, one of life's harsher companions, held a kind of fragile aesthetic. A person resting under blankets, hair damp from fever, a cup of broth steaming nearby. The caregiver's hand on their forehead. A window cracked open just enough for fresh air to slip through. It wasn't beauty in any joyful sense, but it carried tenderness. And tenderness itself has a way of softening everything it touches. Travelers camping at night found beauty in the edges of flame. Faces leaned toward firelight, eyes reflecting the glow, cloaks draped over shoulders like small fortresses against the cold. The crackle of burning wood softened the silence. Even the simplest gesture, someone warming their hands, someone adjusting their hood, looked meaningful when lit by embers. Fire made everyone look quietly heroic, without demanding anything extraordinary from them. And there was beauty in reading, too, at least for the few who could. A monk bent over parchment, tracing careful lines, a merchant studying a letter by lamplight, a young scribe dipping their quill into ink, pausing before writing. Concentration softened the face, drawing features inward. The quiet scratch of the quill became part of the aesthetic. It was a beauty found in thought, not appearance. Friendships shaped it as well. Two people sitting together after a long day, neither talking much, just sharing space. Maybe one picked at loose threads on their sleeve, while the other leaned back against a post. They didn't need to impress each other. The comfort created its own gentle glow. Medieval beauty wasn't shy. It simply didn't need attention to exist. And when people fell in love, everything softened further. A private smile, a passing glance, hands brushing for a second too long while exchanging something simple like a basket or a pitcher. These moments weren't grand, but they left warmth behind them, the kind that stayed in memory longer than any physical detail ever could. Love didn't sharpen beauty, it blurred it into something warmer. Even aging, the slowest sculptor of all, was treated with a kind of acceptance. Wrinkles came early in a life filled with labor and weather, but they weren't disliked. They were simply part of the landscape of a face, valleys carved by laughter, sun, worry, and years of watching the world shift. Older faces weren't compared to younger ones. They were simply different, each shaped by time in its own way. And maybe that's the clearest truth. Medieval beauty wasn't about features at all. It was about atmosphere, a mood, a softness created by low light, slow routines, shared work, and a world without constant reflection. People didn't strive to be beautiful. They just were, in small, quiet ways, shaped by the steady pulse of their lives. A beauty that lived not in perfection, but in presence, not in attention, but in ease. A beauty made entirely of moments that passed as gently as sleep. And if you follow this thread all the way to the edges of medieval life, the places where the world thinned out into pasture, forest, hill, or sea, you find beauty settling like dust, subtle and everywhere, touching people in moments they rarely noticed. On quiet cliffs overlooking distant water, shepherds stood with their cloaks wrapped tight, watching waves churn far below. The wind pressed their hair back, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. Weather shaped every line of their face, but in that vast emptiness, the marks looked like belonging rather than burden. A person alone in nature always carried a certain stillness, and that stillness softened everything about them. Along old stone paths, beauty lived in footsteps. A woman walking slowly with a basket of herbs. A monk traveling between villages with his hood drawn low. A pair of friends sharing the road, their conversation drifting, interrupted by birdsong or breeze. Their cloaks brushed the ground, fabric swaying with each step. Medieval beauty wasn't in the face here, it was in movement, steady and unhurried. Inside barns or stables, where warm breath from animals filled the cold air, beauty glowed faintly in lantern light. Someone running a hand down a horse's neck, someone adjusting straw bedding. The soft sounds of creatures settling in for the night created an atmosphere that gentled every expression. Warmth from living beings, even animals, made faces look kinder, calmer, more at ease. And in the distance between chores, a person might pause, leaning against a fence, resting their hands on the top rail, gazing across fields. Their eyes softened by thought, their mouth relaxed, their weight shifted into comfort. No beauty standard could replicate the simplicity of someone letting the world pass by for a moment, without asking anything of them. Streams held another kind of beauty. People knelt to fill jugs or wash their faces, their reflections rippling gently. Not perfect reflections, but suggestions, a blur of color, shape, motion. Water didn't show flaws, it showed impressions. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was why people didn't obsess. They never saw themselves clearly enough to find fault. Winter brought its own aesthetics. Frost clung to eyelashes, woolen cloaks gathered flakes of snow, breath clouded in the air like small ghosts. A person walking through snowfall looked serene, almost suspended in time, every step muffled. Cold reddened cheeks and noses, but it also softened edges. Winter air made everyone look fragile in a quiet, beautiful way. Summer, by contrast, gave everything a slow radiance. Sweat glistened on temples, tunics clung lightly to backs, and sunlight warmed tired faces. A person leaning over a well to draw water looked like part of a painting, muscles working, jaw set, eyes narrowed against the brightness. Beauty in summer wasn't delicate, it was full, warm, honest. And autumn wrapped people in muted tones, cloaks in browns and faded greens, fields turning gold, smoke rising from chimneys as evenings cooled. Someone carrying firewood across a yard might brush hair from their face with the back of their hand, leaving a streak of soot that somehow looked poetic in that soft, dim light. Autumn made everyone look like they belonged in a story being told slowly. Even rain shaped beauty. A person standing under an awning, hood dripping, hands clasped together for warmth. The steady patter softened the world. Wet hair clung to faces, noses shone slightly, clothing darkened with weight. But rain has a way of making every expression look sincere, tired, hopeful, patient, contemplative. It's hard to hide anything beneath rain. Indoors, late at night, the last embers of the hearth cast long shadows on walls. Someone sitting with their legs tucked beneath them, eyes half closed, the quiet making their posture slump gently. A candle burned down to its final inch, the flame wavering. The moment carried so much stillness that beauty settled over the room like warmth. Medieval nights were long, but not empty. They held a hush that made every gesture softer. And perhaps the most beautiful moments were the ones that passed without witnesses. A young man finishing his chores, pausing to watch the sky turn a final shade of blue. A woman humming to herself while folding linen. A child playing alone with bits of wood and twine. These scenes disappeared almost as quickly as they formed, but they were the purest version of medieval beauty, unobserved, unpolished, born from nothing but the simplicity of existing quietly for a few seconds. By the time you gather all these fragments together, you realize medieval beauty wasn't tied to rules or fashion or even intention. It lived in the atmosphere, in light, in weather, in sound, in the gentle patience of daily life. It wasn't something people chased or measured. It was something that moved with them, settling here and there, softly, like the dim glow of a candle that flickers but never really goes out. And woven through all of this, through the fields, the quiet houses, the dim workshops, the wandering roads, was the simple truth that medieval beauty depended on time. Not on effort, not on technique, not on comparison, only time. The longer you watched someone move through their day, the softer they became. A person rushing to finish a task looked rough at first, but if you watched a few seconds longer, you'd see the rhythm of their motions, the steadiness of their hands, the familiarity of their surroundings shaping them gently. Beauty came from endurance, from repetition, from the slow settling of a life lived close to the world. Think of an old man repairing a fence. At a glance, he looked weathered. Creases, rough hands, a back that carried too many seasons. But if you stayed and watched, even just for a minute, the scene shifted. The quiet concentration, the way he lifted each tool as if it had a long story, the way he paused to gauge the angle of a beam, letting the wind brush against his face. Nothing about him matched an ideal, yet the longer you observed, the more beautiful the moment became. Medieval beauty didn't reward quick glances. It asked you to linger. Or a woman tending her small garden at dusk, her hair loose from a long day, her dress dusted with earth, her movements slow, pulling a weed, checking a sprout, pressing soil back into place. At first she looked tired, but then the light shifted, turning her outline soft, the quiet wrapped around her like a shawl, the warm scent of earth rose around her feet. And suddenly the whole scene felt complete, like something that didn't need adjusting. Beauty often appeared at the edges of tasks, right after someone finished something difficult. A young man straightening up after stacking wood, breath rising in soft white clouds. A woman rubbing warmth back into her hands after hanging laundry in cold air. A child wiping their nose on a sleeve after running too fast. These transitions, these half-seconds of exhale, carried more humanity than any standard of appearance could. Animals shaped beauty as much as people did. A dog trotting beside its owner added warmth to even the most ordinary walk. A cow leaning its head toward a familiar touch softened a farmer's posture. A pair of geese waddling across a yard brought an unexpected quiet humor that made every expression in the moment more relaxed. Beauty wasn't static. It moved through interactions, large and small. And then there were the sounds. Medieval life wasn't silent, but it wasn't overwhelming either. It had a soft, repetitive hum, the thud of chopping wood, the creak of rope, the distant murmur of voices, the splash of water poured from one bucket to another. These sounds shaped people's expressions, slowing them into focus, giving even simple gestures a kind of meditative texture. In modern life, beauty is often sharp and curated. In medieval life, it was blurry and lived in, warmed by the noises of work. Late afternoons carried their own aesthetic. Shadows lengthened, people grew quieter, the air cooled and softened faces. A group sitting outside after finishing chores looked like part of the landscape, faces lit by slanting light, hands resting idly, bodies releasing the tension of the day. They didn't pose, they just existed, and the world arranged itself gently around them. And perhaps the most telling part of medieval beauty is that it rarely centered on the individual, it centered on context. A face alone meant little, but a face next to a hearth, or leaning over a field, or framed by a doorway, or softened by twilight, those combinations created something tender and atmospheric. Without the world around them, people looked plain. With it, they became part of a quiet composition. That's why medieval beauty feels so calming to revisit. It reminds us that appearance was never the point, presence was. Being part of a moment, part of a rhythm, part of a scene shaped by light and season and daily life. A beauty that asked for nothing except that you exist gently within the world, without rushing, without performing, without needing to be anything more than a small, soft figure in a slow-moving day. And as evening deepened, medieval beauty returned to the place it lived most naturally, in transitions. The shift between day and night, work and rest, noise and quiet. People rarely notice these moments, but they shape the face more than any cosmetic ever could. A woman closing the shutters at dusk, her hands lingering on the wooden frame for an extra second as she looked out at the fading sky. The last light touched her cheek, then slipped away, leaving her face half-shadowed, half-warm. Nothing deliberately beautiful happened there, yet the moment carried a softness that felt complete. A man rinsing dust from his hands at a basin, watching the water swirl away in small eddies. The lines on his palms, the pale scars, the quiet concentration, all of it formed a kind of honesty modern beauty rarely includes. He wasn't trying to present himself, he was just washing his hands. And that was enough to create a picture worth remembering. Inside a house, a mother adjusting a child's blanket had the same unintentional elegance. Her movements slow, mindful, shaped by habit rather than thought. A strand of hair falling forward, a faint exhale as she tucked the cloth. In that dim glow, nothing looked sharp or perfect. Everything looked lived in and deeply human. In the corners of taverns where firelight danced across old beams, beauty gathered in the spaces between conversations. Someone listening intently, chin propped on their hand. Someone nursing a cup of ale, eyes wandering as they drifted into thought. Someone laughing quietly, not a big attention-drawing laugh, but the kind that softens the entire upper half of the face. These were the places where medieval beauty felt closest to breath. Even the smallest gestures held it. Someone blowing out a candle, cheeks puffing just slightly, the flame shrinking into a thin ribbon of smoke. Someone brushing crumbs from their lap after a meal. Someone rubbing the back of their neck after leaning over too long. Each motion brief, practical, entirely ordinary, and yet infused with the same slow charm that defined the entire era. In stables, someone brushing a horse in long, steady strokes had a kind of grounded grace. Their head bent forward, their hands moving rhythmically, their breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. Medieval beauty wasn't about looking serene. It was about being serene at random, quiet moments like this. On lonely watchtowers, guards shifted their weight, adjusting cloaks around their shoulders as the wind pressed against ancient stones. Their faces turned toward the dark horizon, eyes narrowing against the cold. Even fatigue, especially fatigue, created its own kind of aesthetic under moonlight, softening the jawline, relaxing the brow, slowing the entire posture into something almost sculptural. And in the fields at night, when only moonlight lit the long grasses, someone walking home alone cast a silhouette so gentle it looked like part of the landscape itself, the sound of their footsteps muffled by earth, their cloak trailing slightly, their head bowed not in sadness but in the calm exhaustion that follows a full day. It was the kind of beauty no artist could fully capture because it didn't exist in the features at all. It existed in the atmosphere. Even prayer before bed carried a muted aesthetic. A person kneeling at a small wooden stool, hands folded loosely, eyes half closed from fatigue. The candle beside them guttered, throwing warm gold across their cheek. That combination, the quiet, the posture, the soft light, created a moment that looked unreal in its gentleness. And finally, when the village fell silent and only embers glowed in the hearths, medieval beauty curled into its softest shape. Someone asleep with a hand resting near their face, someone turning over under a wool blanket, the faint creak of the bed frame punctuating the silence, someone sitting awake a little longer, staring into the fading fire, letting their thoughts drift. No one tried to look a certain way, no one chased an ideal. They simply existed in the dark, warm and breathing and human. This was the essence of medieval beauty. Not found in symmetry or rules, but in moments where life moved slowly enough for softness to appear. A beauty that flickered into existence like candlelight, dim, warm, and impossibly gentle. And when dawn crept back in, medieval beauty reset itself, quietly, almost shyly. The world brightened in slow increments, revealing faces gradually rather than all at once. People woke in stages, a stretch beneath coarse blankets, a slow blink, the faint rustle of straw. In those first few seconds, before thoughts returned, every expression was soft in a way no standard could replicate. Sleep gave the face a vulnerability that felt almost sacred. Then came the small morning tasks, the ones done half awake, always the same, always gentle. Someone tying back their hair with careless fingers. Someone shrugging into a cloak still cool from the night. Someone pouring water into a basin, the sound clean and soft in a quiet room. These motions shaped the beginning of the day more than appearance ever did. Beauty lived in the familiarity of them, in the slow kindness people gave themselves by not rushing. Outside, the village began to stir in a way that looked accidental, one door opening, then another, then the faint murmur of early conversation. People stepped into the new light with sleepy faces that softened even more under the pale sky. Whatever roughness the previous day had carved into them, sun, wind, work, looked gentler after a night's rest. Morning had a way of forgiving the face, smoothing it quietly from the inside out. And in the fields, beauty took on a dew-covered form. Grass shimmered in soft silver, brushing against the hems of skirts and boots. Someone bending to inspect a plant looked like part of the earth itself, wrapped in the low, cool air. Their breath rose in small clouds, disappearing before they noticed. These tiny traces of life made the scene delicate without trying. No cosmetic could create something so fleeting. Along the riverbanks, people gathered with buckets or cloths. Water was cold enough to shock the system, which made expressions tighten briefly before easing into calm. A person cupping their hands to splash their face looked timeless. Stone, water, skin, breath, all part of the same simple rhythm. Even the shiver afterward had its own quiet charm. At midday, the sun revealed more details than anyone asked for. But even then, beauty didn't disappear. It shifted. Faces glowed with heat, brows glistened, clothing clung lightly. People moved a little slower, conserving energy, giving every gesture a soft, deliberate quality. A person wiping sweat from their forehead with the back of their hand looked honest, grounded, like someone shaped by effort rather than image. In shaded alleys, beauty hid in coolness. Someone stepping out of the bright street into shadow looked instantly calmer. Their eyes adjusted, their breathing steadied. Cloaks and tunics loosened slightly as the temperature dropped. It was like watching a painting adjust itself. No drama, just a small shift in light creating a whole new mood. And in workshops, beauty found its way back into focus. A craftsperson leaning over their work, illuminated by a narrow window. Dust motes floating through the beam of light. The steady movement of hands smoothing, shaping, carving. The face, concentrated but serene, framed by soft shadows. These moments made even the simplest task feel meaningful. On hilltops, where paths stretched long and the wind never fully stopped, beauty looked windswept and thoughtful. Someone pausing to breathe, looking out over fields and rooftops. Their cloak tugged by the breeze, hair loosening from its tie. The world felt wide enough to hold them without judgment. Beauty came from that quiet belonging, not from features. By late afternoon, when the sun dipped into gold, medieval beauty hit its warmest point. Everyone looked softer in that light. Eyes warmed, skin glowed, fabric shifted from muted to honey-colored. A person carrying a bucket or gathering herbs looked suddenly poetic. No change in action, just a change in light. The world did the work for them. And in the long evenings, when people sat in doorways or rested on steps, beauty flattened into silhouettes. A family sharing quiet conversation. A traveler tightening their boots before continuing on. A couple sharing a bench, heads leaning closer in the dimness. These outlines said more than any detail could. Finally, as night fell yet again, medieval beauty returned to where it began. In the dimness, in the hush, in the warmth of shared spaces. Someone lighting a candle. Someone whispering across a room. Someone settling into their bedding, exhaling slowly as the day slipped away. And in that cycle, dawn to dusk, work to rest, movement to stillness, beauty existed everywhere. Not as a standard, but as a softness threaded through ordinary life. A beauty that never asked to be noticed, but stayed close anyway, patient as breath, quiet as sleep. And as the cycle continued, day folding into day, season folding into season, medieval beauty revealed its final, quiet truth. It wasn't something people achieved. It was something that happened to them simply by living at the pace the world allowed. The slowness, the dimness, the work, the weather, all of it shaped beauty more gently than any ideal ever could. Evening chores held their own muted charm. A woman sweeping her doorstep, small clouds of dust drifting into late light. A man stacking the last pieces of firewood beside the house, pausing between each load to stretch his back and squint toward the horizon. These weren't grand scenes. They were the soft edges of ordinary life. Faces relaxed when tasks were nearly done, shoulders loosening, weariness turning into a sort of quiet pride. Beauty glimmered in that release, the slow uncoiling of a long day. In the corners of fields, workers gathered their tools, resting them against tree trunks or fences. Their hands, rough and sure, brushed dirt from their palms. Their expressions, tired but easy, held a softness that came from knowing the day had been enough. Even the silence between them, comfortable, unhurried, had its own gentle aesthetic. Medieval beauty often lived in those silences, the ones that filled the spaces between words like a familiar quilt. On the narrow lanes winding between houses, children played until dusk tugged them home. Their laughter trailed through the air like a warm thread, softening every adult face that caught the sound. A mother leaning in a doorway, watching her children with her arms crossed lightly. A father pretending not to smile as a child raced past with a crooked wooden toy. Beauty here wasn't tied to appearance. It was tied to affection, in the way eyes softened for the people they cared for. And in the small rituals of closing the day, beauty took on an even gentler shape. Someone folding a cloak neatly over a bench. Someone shaking crumbs from a cloth before bringing it indoors. Someone brushing ashes from a hearthstone with long, slow strokes. These were the actions that built the rhythm of life, repetitive, familiar, grounding. In those motions, the body moved with a natural grace that had nothing to do with ideals and everything to do with habit. By the time darkness settled fully over the village, the world grew small again. Houses exhaled lamplight through cracks in shutters, paths narrowed into shadows. Even the sounds softened, low voices, the faint scrape of a chair, a dog shifting in its sleep. Faces glowed only near flames, and that dimness softened every feature until people looked almost ageless, like figures painted in warm strokes rather than sharp lines. This was the hour when medieval beauty felt most like a presence rather than a trait. And in the solitude of late night, when most had gone to sleep, a few remained awake just long enough to feel the quiet settle. A young man sitting outside with his elbows on his knees, thinking about the next day. An older woman rubbing warmth into her hands before climbing into bed. A lamp burning low beside someone finishing a final bit of mending. These moments weren't meant to be seen. They weren't beautiful in the theatrical sense, but they carried a softness so human that it became a kind of beauty without intention. Even dreams contributed in a way. People slept curled beneath heavy blankets, breaths steady, faces slack with the weight of honest exhaustion. No mirrors, no comparisons, just rest shaping the features into something peaceful. Medieval beauty ended each day where it began, in vulnerability, in quiet, in the simple act of letting go. And the world outside, fields, forests, hills, waited patiently. In the morning, it would reshape the face again with sunlight or wind or fog. In the evening, it would soften it again with gold and shadow. The landscape itself was part of the aesthetic, pressing its rhythm gently into every expression. That was the heart of it. Medieval beauty wasn't a standard at all. It was a cycle, a pattern, a slow echo of light and labor, rest and routine, breath and season. A beauty that came not from striving, but from existing in a world that moved at the speed of footsteps, not deadlines. A beauty made of moments so quiet they almost passed unnoticed, until you sat still long enough to recognize that softness had been sitting beside you the whole time, patient as dusk, steady as dawn. And if you follow that rhythm far enough, past the days, past the seasons, past the quiet rituals that shaped every hour, you start to see how medieval beauty wasn't merely part of life. It was woven into the passing of life itself. Not a decoration, not a performance, but a quiet companion that appeared whenever the world slowed just enough to show something honest. You could see it in the way people paused before stepping into the cold, a woman pulling her shawl tighter, taking one last breath of warm air before opening the door. A man testing the leather of his boots with a firm press, steadying himself for whatever weather waited. These small hesitations shaped the face more gently than any ideal. They held a softness that came from awareness, the moment before discomfort, before effort, before departure. Out in the fields, at the end of harvest, beauty lay in fatigue rather than perfection. Workers sat on overturned baskets or low stones, sharing a stretch of silence broken only by distant birds. Their faces were streaked with sweat and dust, but their expressions were easy, almost serene. Tiredness smoothed everything, releasing the sharp edges of worry. Nothing looked polished, but everything looked true. On long journeys, when travelers reached a crossroads and stopped to consider their path, beauty appeared in their posture, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, cloak shifting in a faint breeze. The uncertainty gave their face a quiet openness. Medieval people didn't pose, but crossroads made them look like sculptures carved from a thoughtful pause. Even illness, which shaped so much of medieval life, revealed its own tender aesthetic. The face of someone being cared for, eyes half-lidded, hair damp, features softened by vulnerability, carried a kind of fragile beauty rooted not in appearance but in dependence. And the caregiver, whether family or neighbor, often looked more beautiful still, hands gentle, expression patient, breath measured. Medieval beauty was often shared, passed between people through the smallest acts of kindness. At night, in the moments before sleep, beauty took on a hush so deep it felt like a blanket. Someone lying on their side, one knee slightly bent, breath warm against their blanket. Someone tracing idle circles in the straw beside them, thinking of things they would never say aloud. Someone staring at the ceiling beams, letting the crackle of a dying fire lull them into stillness. These were the moments when humanity revealed itself without guard or effort, and in that unguarded space, beauty gathered like soot on a warm hearth. When storms rolled across the landscape, beauty shifted again. People sheltering beneath eaves, hair plastered by rain, clothes darkened and heavy. A child burying their face in a parent's cloak. A shepherd guiding animals into shelter with hurried patience. The urgency dulled everything into simple shapes, bodies, movement, breath. Storms stripped beauty down to its core, presence in the midst of discomfort. Even aging, the slowest weather of all, shaped beauty in ways medieval people never questioned. A face lined from years of squinting into sun, hands knotted from decades of work, eyes softened by familiar griefs and small contentments. No one expected the old to look young. They expected them to look true, and that truth carried a beauty deeper than any fleeting ideal of smoothness. And in the quietest hours of the year, winter nights when the moon hung low and snow muffled the world, beauty appeared as a hush over everything. Someone lighting a single candle, someone wrapping their cloak around their shoulders, sitting near the fire without speaking, someone smoothing wool over their lap as they waited for sleep. Cold air made every movement slower, every breath more visible, every face more sincere. By the time you gather all these moments, morning routines, evening chores, pauses between work, breaths between thoughts, you realize medieval beauty wasn't found in faces at all. It was found in pacing, in the slowness of gestures, in the dimness of light, in the softness of being human in a world that never moved faster than the body could follow. It was the beauty of survival, of presence, of small comforts in a life shaped by weather and work. A beauty that didn't need approval, didn't seek attention, didn't worry about perfection. A beauty that simply existed quietly, gently, as natural as breath, and as patient as the turning of the seasons. And if you stretch that thread just a little farther, past the rhythm of seasons, past the glow of hearthlight, past the quiet tenderness of ordinary moments, you eventually reach the places where medieval beauty slipped into memory. Because in a world without mirrors, without portraits for most people, without photographs, beauty didn't stay on the surface. It lived in recollection, in the way someone remembered a person rather than the way they actually looked. A friend might recall another's face in the way their eyes warmed when listening, or the curve of their smile after a long day, or the way their silhouette looked against evening light. Beauty became a collection of impressions, softened over time, shaped less by accuracy and more by feeling. And in many ways, that made it gentler. Beauty was not a comparison, it was a comfort. You can imagine an old man sitting near the fire, describing someone he once knew. He wouldn't talk about cheekbones or symmetry. He'd talk about the way she braided her hair on windy mornings, or how her laugh made the entire room settle. In those memories, beauty didn't vanish with time. It became warmer, blurry in a way that made it even more human. And in small gatherings, family meals, winter evenings, quiet moments of storytelling, beauty blurred into atmosphere. Someone might say, "She had a calm way about her," or "He always looked steady when he worked." And that was enough. Those were the medieval compliments. Beauty wasn't something you pointed at, it was something you felt when someone entered the room. Walking through forests, beauty was shaped by silence. A person moving carefully on a narrow trail looked thoughtful simply because they were listening, to branches cracking, to distant streams, to the endless hush of leaves. Their face softened in concentration, their steps measured. In that empty space, their presence felt almost poetic, though no one would think to call it that. They were simply part of the woods. Along rivers, beauty shimmered in passing glances. A fisherman pulling in a net, jaw tensed in focus. A girl skipping stones near the bank, hem of her dress brushing the water. A traveler kneeling to drink, cupping his hands, breath visible in the cool air. Each of these motions held a quiet dignity shaped by necessity, not display. Then there were the fleeting moments, instances so brief they barely existed, but somehow carried the purest version of beauty. A hand brushing frost from a window, a lantern swinging slightly as someone walked, a pair of neighbors exchanging a small nod in the morning chill. These scenes lasted only seconds, but they filled the days like small breaths of warmth. If someone cried, their beauty didn't disappear, it changed. Tears softened the face, made it more open, more honest. In a world where life was harder and shorter, sorrow didn't separate people. It reminded them of their closeness. A person comforting another looked beautiful, not because of features, but because their presence offered shelter. And joy, real joy, made people glow in ways no ideal could match. At weddings, faces lit by torches shimmered with laughter. At festivals, flushed cheeks were streaked with heat, eyes bright from music or ale. These weren't polished moments, but they were alive, and that aliveness carried its own unmistakable warmth. Even arguments held their own strange aesthetic. Two people standing close, voices low but firm, gestures tight. Not beautiful in the decorative sense, but beautiful in the human sense. Evidence of emotion, of connection, of stories unfolding between people trying to navigate life together. And when people said goodbye, whether for a journey, a season, or forever, beauty clung to the moment like dust in sunlight. A hand squeezed tightly, a face held just a second longer, a soft exhale before separation. No one thought of beauty then, but that's exactly when it was strongest. Ultimately, medieval beauty wasn't an image, it wasn't a goal or a look or a standard. It was a feeling, a slow, atmospheric presence shaped by light, by fatigue, by kindness, by silence, by laughter, by weather, by the thousand tiny gestures that made up life. It appeared when people were most themselves, when they forgot to perform, when they were simply part of the world around them. A beauty that lived in the pauses, in the breath between tasks, in the hush between words, in the warmth between people. A beauty that didn't need to be seen to exist, only lived. And if you follow those lived moments to the very quietest edges of medieval life, the corners where thought drifted and time loosened, you start to see how beauty wasn't just part of daily existence, but part of the way people understood themselves. Not through mirrors, not through scrutiny, but through presence. Through how it felt to be alive in a world that moved slower than breath. Take the quiet hour before sunrise, when most of the village still slept. A single person awake, maybe a baker preparing dough, maybe someone who simply couldn't sleep, moved through dim spaces where light hadn't fully arrived, their outlines softened by the faint glow of embers, their hands steady, careful. In that stillness, they looked almost suspended between night and day, their features blurred into something calm. Medieval beauty thrived most in those thresholds, places where the world wasn't one thing or another, but resting gently in between. In moments of solitude outdoors, beauty became something even simpler. A young woman sitting beside a low stone wall, plucking at a stem of grass while thinking of nothing in particular. A man leaning back against a haystack, eyes closed, listening to the wind hum through the fields. No audience, no expectation, just bodies shaped by quiet, letting themselves exist without effort. These were the moments people never remembered clearly afterward, yet they held the deepest softness. Inside homes, warmth shaped beauty more than anything. A child asleep with their cheek pressed against a wooden table. A grandmother humming softly while untangling yarn. A father repairing a latch as a lantern flickered behind him. In that gentle, uneven glow, everyone looked a little kinder, a little more human. Light forgave every imperfection. Shadows added gentleness where none had been intended. You didn't have to try to look beautiful, you just had to sit near a flame. And in the pauses between words, beauty took on a different form entirely. Two people sharing quiet conversation, slow, thoughtful, unhurried. One leaning closer, the other listening with their hands folded. The entire space softened by the absence of noise. Medieval beauty wasn't animated, it wasn't bright or sharp. It lived in these small, hushed pockets where the world stopped tugging for attention. Even tasks that held no aesthetic intention at all acquired their own slow grace. Someone bundling herbs for drying, fingertips brushing leaves gently. Someone threading a needle in late daylight, squinting with patient concentration. Someone smoothing wrinkles from a cloak before stepping outdoors. These tiny acts, performed 100 times without thought, shaped the body's movements into something naturally elegant, not polished, but honest. In times of uncertainty, beauty softened people in unexpected ways. A young man pacing slowly near a barn door, rehearsing words he didn't know how to speak. A woman standing still at a crossroads, cloak fluttering lightly as she tried to gather courage. A pair of friends sitting side by side in silence after hearing difficult news. Medieval beauty didn't disappear during hardship. It simply dimmed into something more tender, shaped by humility rather than brightness. And laughter, simple, genuine laughter, changed faces instantly. A group of workers sharing a joke in the fields. A mother trying not to laugh as her toddler attempted to imitate grown-up tasks. A friend clutching their stomach because they couldn't stop giggling. No painted lips,